Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Nonfiction November is just around the corner, so I wanted to hop on to talk about some of the nonfiction books on my TBR that I am realistically going to try and tackle in the next month. But before I get into the books, I wanted to quickly encourage all of my fellow Americans out there to vote in next week's presidential election. And by vote, I mean vote blue. Make a voting plan, maybe consider voting early if that's an option in your state, and be sure to be voting in all of your down ballot state and local elections as well. You probably don't need me to tell you how important it is, especially this year, so get out there and make sure your voice is heard. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. As I mentioned, I'm trying to be realistic about how many books I can reasonably read for Nonfiction November this year, and so I have selected 4 titles for my official TBR. But as I go through them, I will be mentioning some related nonfiction books that are on my kind of more general, longer-term TBR as well. The first book I have here is a book that was actually on my Nonfiction November TBR 2 years ago that I never got around to, and that is Nothing Ever Dies: Vietnam and the Memory of War by Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is the author of The Sympathizer. And I have consumed my fair share of books and movies about the Vietnam War as it's known to Americans, media that I believe Nguyen would describe as cultural byproducts of the memory industry. And so I'm very curious to read his thoughts on how we collectively remember and metabolize a thing like war. And I think the war in Vietnam is a particularly interesting case study for that, just because it was such a fraught and prolonged and kind of unwieldy conflict when it was happening, and it remains quite fraught and unwieldy in American memory at least, and I imagine in Vietnamese memory as well. And I've actually already started reading this one, so I'm feeling optimistic that I will be able to finish it this time around. I'm slightly worried that the academic jargon and somewhat circular argumentation in this book is going to start to get to me. He's already said, for example, that the so-called memory industry is merely a symptom of something more pervasive, the industrialization of memory, which but I'm hopeful that the ideas in this book will transcend the academic semantics. Another book on my long-term TBR that's kind of in that vein is a book called The Future of Nostalgia by Svetlana Boym. And a friend recently recommended this to me, and from what I understand, it looks at the idea of national and collective nostalgia, particularly in post-communist cities in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think it could be really interesting to compare those two books eventually at some point. The second book on my Nonfiction November TBR this year is Visible Man: The Life of Henry Dumas by Jeffrey B. Leake, which I've mentioned on this channel a couple times in the past few months. Henry Dumas was a Black writer of poetry and short fiction whose life and artistic career were cut short when he was killed by police in New York City in 1968. Prior to his death, he was active in the Black arts movement, and later Toni Morrison said that his work was, quote, some of the most beautiful, moving, and profound poetry and fiction that I have ever in my life read. Unfortunately, in the succeeding decades, much of Henry Dumas's work went out of print, and so when I first heard about him this summer, I picked up this biography kind of in lieu of being able to read any of his actual books. However, in good news, I just saw that a collection of his poetry, Knees of a Natural Man, is being reissued and is actually going to be out later this week on October 30th, and a collection of his short fiction called Echo Tree is also being reissued by Coffeehouse Press and will be available next May. So I'm going to leave links for both of those books down below if you want to check them out, and I will hopefully be able to pair this relatively short biography with Knees of a Natural Man and then come back and talk about them together. Somewhat in that vein, the third book that I want to read for Nonfiction November this year is To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, which is alternately described as an informal autobiography of Lorraine Hansberry or Lorraine Hansberry in her own words. This is a collection of Lorraine Hansberry's plays, essays, letters, and drawings that was published a few years after her untimely death from cancer in 1965. And it was edited and kind of collated by her ex-husband and literary executor Robert Nemiroff. It does sound like this book kind of blends genres, but because it's so often described as an autobiography of sorts, I'm gonna say that that counts for Nonfiction November. I read A Raisin in the Sun for the first time this year and really loved it, and so I wanted to explore more of Lorraine Hansberry's writing. And I also thought it would be interesting to pair with the Henry Dumas just because they were both Black writers writing at around the same time in the 1950s and 60s, and both of whose lives were cut short kind of in their prime. Lorraine Hansberry was 34 when she died. Henry Dumas was 33 when he was killed. So two incredibly young talents who were maybe not even at their peaks yet artistically, and yet who were able to leave behind more work than most people are able to put out in one lifetime. So I'm eager to get into this. And then on my longer term TBR, I also want to eventually get to Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry by Imani Perry, which is a biography of Lorraine Hansberry that came out a couple of years ago that I've heard fantastic things about. And lastly, I recently listened to all 22 hours of the audiobook for The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, which is her doorstopper book about the Great Migration. I'll talk more about that book in my October wrap-up next week, but I believe it's one of the longest nonfiction audiobooks I've ever listened to, and I really loved the experience of just being immersed in this long, meaty, substantial nonfiction book. And so I'm trying to replicate that experience during Nonfiction November, and I'm trying to find another long audiobook that I can read throughout the month of November. And I think I might listen to Brooklyn, the Once and Future City by Thomas J. Campanella, even though I'm not sure that I'm totally jiving with the narrator of this based on the sample that I listened to. I've been biking around Brooklyn since I've been back in New York, and a few weeks ago, my roommate and I biked out to Sunset Park, which is this neighborhood where you're a little bit further out and can kind of see the water. And in these kind of brief snatches here and there while we were biking out there, I was really reminded of neighborhoods like the Sunset or the Richmond in San Francisco, where you just kind of feel like you're on the edge of the world towards the water. I don't know, maybe I was projecting a little bit onto Sunset Park in that moment, but it kind of got me thinking about like cities and sense of place, and I was just struck by this strong desire to find a big chunky book about Brooklyn so that I could kind of better understand its history as a city and its neighborhoods and the groups of people that have formed communities here and cycled in and out through forces of gentrification. And so based on what I could find via Google, Brooklyn, the Once and Future City seems like a good option for that, although if any of you out there have better books on that subject that you can recommend, definitely let me know in the comments below. But yeah, I think I'm always very interested in reading more about the places that I'm living in or that I have lived in. Earlier this year, I really enjoyed reading Golden Gates by Connor Doherty, which is about the Bay Area's housing crisis. And I still have American Babylon, Race and the Struggle for Post-War Oakland by Robert O. Self on my perpetual TBR. In an ideal world, I would definitely be able to read the Brooklyn book and then this Oakland book in relatively close succession. We can all dream. But yeah, I think that when you're living in a particular place, you often accept a lot of things as just givens. And so I love great books about history that kind of crack your brain open and help you understand why things are the way they are. And I always enjoy those kind of aha moments that they can set off. So I'm hoping that'll be the case with this book. And actually, if you live in a particular place and have read a really good book, especially a history book about that place, I'd be really curious to hear about that. So please let me know below if you have read any books like that. Another option for a long audiobook could also be Frederick Douglass' Prophet of Freedom by David W. Blight, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History last year. And I love David Blight. I have listened to and watched a number of his lectures about the Civil War. He's another person who looks closely at war and memory, but I'm ashamed to say that I've never actually read any of his books. And I don't know that I'm like super interested in Frederick Douglass, at least not in a let me put on a 37-hour audiobook about his life kind of way. But maybe that's just because I don't know enough about him. And I also do think that biography, when it's done well, can be a really interesting angle through which to learn about the history that a person lived through. And given the sheer length of this book, I would have to imagine that there's plenty of historical context in there in addition to everything else. So I don't know, maybe I'll start listening to this and the Brooklyn book and just see which one I'm more drawn into. Unless any of you out there have better recommendations for chunky history books, I'm definitely open to other ideas. Those are the books that I am planning to tackle for Nonfiction November this year, but I also wanted to touch on a few other books that are on my general nonfiction TBR that are closer to the top of the list than the bottom. One of those is Braiding Sweetgrass: Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I'm super eager to read this book, but I also have this feeling that I should maybe wait until I'm back in Wisconsin sometime to read it. I usually have very strong visual memories of where I was when I read a particular book. Like when I think of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, I think of reading it over the course of one summer when I was in Wisconsin. And so for another nature-centric book like Braiding Sweetgrass, I feel like reading it in my apartment in New York City with cars blaring out the window is maybe not the vibe. And then some other nature-ish books that I'm hoping to read sooner rather than later are Landmarks by Robert Macfarlane, Underland: A Deep Time Journey by Robert Macfarlane, and then Annals of the Former World by John McPhee. And the more I've looked at this book, the more I've actually really wanted to get into it sometime soon. So maybe this will be a chunky book goal for 2021. And then another pair of nonfiction books that I want to read someday soon, and ideally alongside one another, are Our Beloved Kin by Lisa Brooks and The Name of the War by Jill Lepore, which are both books about King Philip's War that were published 20 years apart. Our Beloved Kin came out last year, and then The Name of the War came out in 1998. And they both won the Bancroft Prize, which is one of the most prestigious prizes for American history writing. And so I think it could be really interesting to kind of read and compare those books. I was put on to Our Beloved Kin by one of my friends who is getting her PhD in American Studies, and it sounds like there's kind of some interesting critical discussion that has happened around that book. And so I'm interested in getting to that one in particular just because it seems like it's kind of at the center of some interesting conversations that are happening. Those are some of the top books on my nonfiction TBR. Let me know what you're planning to read for Nonfiction November if you're participating this year. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!